Kim Powell studied 17,000 leaders, then co-authored a New York Times bestseller. Let's find out what she discovered. Hi, Kim. Welcome to the People Quotient podcast. Lovely to have you here.
It's great to be here, Rohit. Thanks for having me.
I'm very excited. You have accomplished so much. You've spent your career focused on people, but then beyond that, you've gone ahead and you've written a New York Times bestseller, which is not a common thing for this podcast to have best-selling authors come speak to us. I thought there's so much richness that you'll be sharing with us, especially as it relates to leaders and CEOs. I find that super exciting. So thank you for taking the time. When you think about your background, how did you get to this point?
Yeah, it's funny. I often, cocktail parties or you're out with friends, what do you do? And I have a hard time describing what it is I do these days, which, necessitates a bit of walking through the past. So honestly, you talk about a career, 25 years dedicated to people. I actually started, like many, I think, of your audience probably, doing strategic consulting. So it started, the very root of it was not necessarily people oriented. It was very much business oriented and understanding the drivers of business, but very quickly realized that without implementation of great ideas, there's no value created. And then ultimately, without the right people in the right roles, you won't be able to execute and implement and deliver that value. That was really the turning point for me, was the shift from purely strategic work to long transformation projects at my first stint at BCG, and recognizing I really wanted to dig into the capabilities that were required and then the individuals that comprise those capabilities. And how do we cultivate that both organizationally and through our hiring to get the right people on the field, the right teams on the field. And that was the pivot point for me to join ghSMART and really specifically spend my time on the question around how do we ensure we've got the right talent at the right stage to deliver against whatever the thesis might be at that moment. Yeah. And then how does that change over time as an organization changes, the strategy changes, the business grows, it necessitates sometimes new and different talent. And so how do you navigate those shifts? So I spent about 8 years at ghSMART really doing that work, both the hiring decisions around who needs to be leading those changes in companies, and then also supporting those leaders after they've been put in place to evolve the organization so it has the capabilities needed. And then a couple of years back, I guess 3.5 years ago now, decided to go ahead and go out on my own. So I have my own firm now where I do, I advise as I had in the past, also sit on a couple of boards, and fundamentally, and I'll steal maybe from my former firm because I really do love the mission at ghSMART, which is to amplify the positive impact people can have on the world. At the most simple level, that's what motivates me. And I have the freedom and flexibility now to focus on the clients where I feel like I personally can make a difference and that they are making a difference in the world writ large.
Yeah, no, I love it. I think you every soundbite you shared there, I echo that. People are the fuel. Even whether you're an investor or an operator, if you get the right humans and then support them, and I often say get out of their way, even that's part of the supporting, but knowing when to do what, but it starts with the people. So I love that. And it was at ghSMART that you had actually also done using the research. You'd also gone and written that book or co-authored the book that went on to do so well. And that was driven by, again, your passion for wanting to really dig into the data. Would that be a fair statement?
Yeah, no, I mean, I would say coming into a firm like ghSMART, they had done at the time, maybe like 17,000 senior leader assessments. And coming out of BCG, you're honed to love data, right?
Yes.
It's the answer to everything, right? And it felt like such a gold mine. Yeah. To have, and to back up a second, an assessment in that parlance is a career walkthrough of an executive, even including pre-career elements. What shapes them? And it's so I call it a semi-structured 5-hour interview in great detail. And to have the highs and lows 360 feedback along the way, what led to the next role across an individual's career times 17,000 is a pretty unique data
Massive.
set. We also had the benefit because of the position we played in where we advised to have board access. So we went and collected performance feedback from the boards of a subset of that data, which was the research that we spent our time doing. Like what correlated, what do we see have statistically significant relationships with the high performing, in this case, CEOs, which was the subset. So I wrote the book. It started though with really a love of the research, and it started as an article actually in HBR. And so from there, we realized, wow, this is maybe a little bit unique, both how we came to the insights and the fact that it was data driven. And HBR and others were encouraging us to write a book. And my co-author Elena and I were like, okay, well, I guess we're going to give it a go. But it's a big leap between doing research because it's interesting to just an article to an entire 75,000 word book. And that was its own journey for sure. There were some highs and lows in that, but ultimately proud of what we were able to put out into the world and proud of some of the myths we could debunk. I think for me personally, there's a lot of motivation when I work with very senior, very accomplished, impressive leaders, and I see what's behind the curtain day to day. I see, where they stub their toes or where they have a lack of confidence or the struggles. When you pick up the paper, all you read about generally are the wins and then like the very high profile crash and burns. It's everything seems quite exaggerated. And I certainly felt like leading at that scale would not be possible. Like these individuals are bigger than life. To be a CEO like that requires some out of the ordinary exceptional talent that normal humans can't comprise. And that was really in contrast with what we saw. So the data that we found was not that these are impossible behaviors, that they, are certainly things that I think everyone can build and strengthen to become a better leader. And that was really motivating. So it was, I guess, a message that I felt compelled to put out in the world.
Yeah, that's really, really cool. And not to get sidetracked, dabbling in the world of writing a book, I am learning so much more about what I don't know and how complex that is. So congratulations on having done that and having written such a successful book. And I'm sure that the process itself was revealing, but both the journey as well as the outcome must be remarkable to look back on. I think that's pretty spectacular. When I think about the book, there are 4, if I'm not mistaken, specific behavioral traits or behaviors that you found about exceptional leaders that you thought were very common.
Yeah. So it's interesting because the research was completed, we published in 2018. So the research was completed, a year and a half prior to that, or 2 years prior to that, to allow for the writing process, obviously. And at the time, we had partnered with SAS, which is a data science organization that we had close relationships with. And they were applying machine learning algorithms to this qualitative data set, which at the time was very cutting edge. It sounds funny to say today with all the progress that's been had over the last, 10 years. It's incredible. I think what we were doing was just child's play, if you will. But it was interesting and unique insofar as the research that we did was not experimental, meaning it wasn't designed to test whether a behavior was or was not impactful. And it also wasn't experiential from the standpoint of it wasn't a leader's story. Like fundamentally, the algorithms that they ran on our data looked for relationships and patterns of behavior in these written assessments. And there were 4 that were statistically related to the high-performing CEOs. So luckily we had that performance data so we could segment the CEOs that exceeded or met or exceeded their performance goals given to them or aligned on with the board, and the CEOs that did not. And the 4 behaviors, we call it DARE just because it's easier to remember. But
it is.
The specific differentiators were, they were decisive. So that was the first. The D is decisive. And this is really about the speed and volume of decisions that are made, as opposed to necessarily the quality. Decisive leaders, those that made decisions faster and a higher velocity, were 12 times more likely to be a high-performing CEO.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
The second behavior, dare, and dare is A, adapt. So proactively adapting the business. Leaders that were strong at proactively adapting their businesses were 7 times more likely to be a high-performing CEO. And I'll just run through it quickly. We can backtrack as you see fit. But the is R in dare, reliably deliver. Yeah. It was funny when this came through when we were talking to the data scientist. It's kind of boring, like reliably delivering. Of course, you should deliver against your expectations. Interestingly, this was the only one that was statistically related to being hired and high performing. So we actually had 2 variables that we were looking at. Both were they hired or not for the CEO role, and then once they were in the CEO role, did they outperform, meet or not meet expectations?
Got it.
And yes, we can break that down as well. But 15 times more likely to be a high-performing CEO if you had a pattern of reliable delivery through your career. And then the last behavior is engaging for impact. So leaders this is really about the art of constructive dissatisfaction, which sounds kind of odd to say, but as a CEO, you are constantly weighing counter needs, meaning if you fully fulfill your employee needs, let's say, you're unlikely to please your shareholders. If you fully please your shareholders, you are likely to please your customers and vice versa. So you're constantly balancing slightly dissatisfied stakeholders. And the best CEOs that did this in a way that kept people aligned and that had very strong intent for what they wanted to achieve out of their relationships and interactions, they were twice as likely to be high performing. So let me pause because I just kind of.
That's very good. Really interesting. We could spend days, but I sort of, as you were going through, I was reflecting on, do I do all of that myself? Where do I stack up and what are my chances? But I think it's very interesting. It almost sounds like the ability to reliably deliver seems to be the highest predictor of success. And I think it makes sense when you think about it, because consistency, being able to predict where you're going to get to, being able to bring the team along, so it all probably falls into that bucket without sort of peeling the onion. That makes intrinsic sense. I think the question for you, there's so many questions, but the one that sort of I think about right away is, did you also look at folks who weren't the high performers? So, obviously you looked at the top of the data set in terms of performers. Did you also say, what are the traits that should not be there? So I'm sort of thinking of from the investor perspective, when I've hired CEOs, it's as important to look at what we need. And there is obviously a really good framework, but then also like very quickly get to like, well, hang on, these are the things you should probably, stay away from. Did you look at that data set too before I go deep into there?
Well, so one of the things we looked at were the character traits, or for lack of a better term, and behaviors, more traits, frankly, that we typically see leaders described as or defined as that don't correlate with performance, right? And there were things like charismatic extroverts, right? So when you think about people who pop into your head when you say, who is an amazing leader? They tend to be extroverted. They tend to be charismatic. What we found in the data set is confidence is actually not correlated. There's no statistical relationship with performance. And there's a lot of debate in our data set. So there's a lot of debate out there, like higher performing leaders are clearly higher confidence leaders didn't show up. Introverts were actually slightly higher performing than extroverts in our data set. They represented about 30% of the population. Okay. So if you think about, certainly there were more extroverts than introverts, but you'd certainly be successful, right, as an introvert. So that's one example. I mean, obviously you think about things like intelligence and pedigree. Pedigree had no relationship with performance. We actually had more CEOs without college degrees than we had with Ivy League degrees, which is interesting. And then actually and I think there are other studies out there that show kind of IQ is not necessarily related to performance in a CEO context above a certain level. And that was true in our research as well. So we certainly looked at some things you automatically might think about as being related that really, you shouldn't be looking at this as a heuristic for performance.
I'm so glad you brought up that point, because consistently on this podcast, when CEOs have come in and shared their thoughts, one of the common themes that they do talk about is that don't get swayed by just the bling and just the brand. Do your diligence, because obviously you've got the research, but this is cumulatively hundreds of years of CEO experience, and they were saying the exact same thing. But the other thing that you brought up, which is very insightful, is that EQ versus EQ. And I talk about this a lot. I've talked about this in all my prior lives in private equity, but also now in what. And if I look at the DARE model, and correct me if this is wrong, at least 3 of the 4 behavioral traits or behaviors are very empathy driven. When you think about adaptability, when you think about reliability, when you think about engagement, those things require that human element. And so I'm not surprised that you said that it's not that you don't have to have IQ. It's just that EQ, if to simplify, leads having high EQ, but now the use of this database is proving too. Mine's more years of experience. But I sort of think that is very insightful, because a lot of people listening, it's very easy when you're trying to hire a CEO or a senior leader on your team to look at the CV or resume saying, wow, great pedigree, must be good. Could be true, but hey, dig deeper. And the second thing is IQ is important, but EQ really leads the way, is really the message that I'm oversimplifying, but I think that's what I'm taking away from what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. There's the table stakes. IQ's kind of table stakes, and above a certain point, it just does not differentiate versus EQ does. It was I had a CEO tell me once, this is a super funny quote, because he had a senior hire that he had made and it didn't work out. And his comment was like, to the guy, I hired your resume, but what I got was you.
Yeah, such a true statement.
It's easy to fall. It's easy to fall prey.
How much of what you found, now you fast forward, you're working with private equity, you're working with early stage, late stage CEOs and leaders, you're working with a whole gamut of people on your own. How much of the research that the data, the DARE model, are you seeing manifest in how things are shaping up a few years down the road from your experience?
Yeah. Interestingly, I would say all the behaviors are relevant in what I am seeing drive success. To be clear, my area of focus right now is a lot mid-market, lower mid-market, first-time CEOs, founder-led businesses. Because I had spent quite a bit of time up market during my days at SMART, and there's plenty of great SMART advisors that can service. They have a lot of access to support. And I find a lot of fulfillment in working in the gritty, very difficult, scrappy early stages of growth.
Yeah.
And partnering with those CEOs and founders. And if I tick through them, I recently working with a new founder, and man, I'm not sure. He may set the bar on the decisiveness behavior in terms of the pace of his decision making. Yeah. And things happen real time in our conversations that would take other CEOs weeks to get around to in terms of follow-ups.
Yeah.
I think of sometimes lack of decisiveness can be almost like a virus. Follow the leader in some ways, especially in these size businesses. And when you set the pacing of how decisions should move in an organization, others will follow. Yeah. And this business is growing at a rate that's pretty rare, especially over the last 24 months. And then happens to be a tech business, but growing much faster than we have seen through 22, 23 in particular, and in the first part of 24. Enormous growth. And it's because this particular founder is setting the pace. And I think, in terms of adapt proactively, again, I feel like it's an evergreen behavior. The leaders had the benefit to work with some who have had massive pivots through COVID, right? And the impacts that had on their businesses. And being willing to, again, recognize the need to change both themselves and the business during those times, significant different philosophies on growth, and being able to pivot from growth at all costs to, I need to conserve and cut costs, and cash is king, and making those moves, more effectively than other leaders has paid off. And some have navigated the waters very well, pivoted their businesses, found other niches. So that definitely resonates And the same with reliably deliver and engaging for impact. They are very evergreen, I would say, behaviors.
Yeah. The one question that I had in terms of decisiveness, and you mentioned there was 12 times, likely somebody who's decisive to be an outperformer. There is a trade-off, of course, speed to action, and I love speed to action, but there's obviously, I think you did mention that it's not the quality, it's the velocity and volume of decision-making. Mm-hmm. And so how have you found that those who, where in this their frame, those who are decisive, but they get it wrong? Because I've met plenty of people who are very decisive, but perhaps they shouldn't be making the decisions at all. And so, with all due respect. And so the question comes back to, if I'm thinking about either the CEO that I'm hiring or working with in my portfolio, or I am the CEO, and sort of thinking about like, okay, do I need to go fast? And is it like, am I too slow? And of course, there's a whole conversation about what is fast and what is slow. I think it's all relative to what you're trying to build. But then how have you helped CEOs calibrate that quality aspect? Is really my question. So it's not, people who listen to this don't go away thinking, well, I'm going to make fast decisions today. And the next thing you know is chaos, because that's the other piece that comes with it, where fast decision making leads for organization to catch up, and too much change and too much movement, I know for a fact, can be unsettling for the employees. And so any counsel or any observations on that?
Yep. Yeah. One kind of more meta level comment, which is, we did take a look at this at individuals who were kind of poor on this dimension, not performing, like would not be considered decisive. And were there issues on moving too fast, or were the issues on moving too slow? So if you're not strong on the decisiveness dimension, like in which direction do you tend to err? And I want to say, and I may have this number off by a couple of percentages in my memory, but I think it was 94% tended to move too slowly. So there's a meta comment which says, yes, absolutely, you can just not have great judgment, and as a result, or not use data, or be miscalibrated to your context, or whatever it might be. But the vast majority of humanity tends to move too slow rather than too fast. So that's kind of a meta comment. What I would say is the most effective leaders I have seen ask themselves the question of, and I think Steve, or who was it? It was Bezos used this term, like, is this decision a one-way or a two-way door? And recognizing which decisions could be one-way doors. And then a founder recently who was like, it's really hard for me to think of any decisions as a one-way door, because almost everything can be made into a two-way door. But to be clear, it depends on investment level thresholds and time thresholds, right? Everyone has their different bar. But I would encourage people to think about for themselves, is this going to be a decision that's very difficult to peel back, or incredibly costly if you get it wrong? And use that as your guide. I would say the vast majority are two-way doors. And what you find with very decisive leaders is it's not that they're making them all correctly, but they've either broken the problem down into smaller decisions such that the cost is lower, but the learning rate is so much higher that they can course correct much more quickly, right? Than if you sat to gather more data, if you sat to tackle it in a bigger chunk, or you sat to wait to make sure you were more sure. And so I think generally I encourage leaders to speed up, more so than get it right. But I would say it usually manifests in two places. One is around priorities. So making the tough decisions around where are we going to focus or not focus. People struggle to make that decision, and as a result, you see priorities proliferating and not wanting to say no to people, and that causes its own trouble. And then the second place is on people, right? It's very difficult to be decisive on individuals that may or may not be a good fit. And people move too slowly generally in those as well.
No, I love that, because I think I use for myself and for others that I work with is, the two words, ruthless prioritization. It often forces that decision making to be more clinical and speedier. But they prioritize your people, and then that way you have both. You start with the right priority and you move quickly. But I do like your comment about, making sure that you've got the right judgment, and perhaps breaking down the required decision into smaller bite sizes to allow yourself as a leader to make quicker decisions. And again, your counsel is not to rush. That's not what you're saying. You're saying make informed decisions, but more often than not, people are taking longer than they need to. And so it is a sort of, as going back to the comment you made earlier in the conversation, some of these skills can be trained, they can be developed. As you think about the prioritization aspect, making sure that if you've got a high priority, first of all, like your counsel is setting the priorities, the decision making on that is key. That set the priorities quickly so people are not wondering where this is, what's going to be happening, and then acting on those priorities specifically as relates to people. And so that allows them, what are we solving for? And that is the company moves faster, learns quicker, adapts quickly, and then you're able to give yourself as a leader an opportunity to redirect, as opposed to having waited so long. Markets have shifted, the economy has moved, your competitors have moved, and you kind of hang on. Now, the decision I was wanting to make 6 months ago is no longer even relevant. I've got to make a different decision. So as an operator, I can completely resonate with that, and it makes so much sense. But as you said, there are certain decisions that just require the right amount of time, but what is that time comes with the right counselors around you. And so that's the other piece that I found. I think it goes back to your point about leaders who engage. If you're engaging with the right stakeholders around you, they can help you get to the speedier decision making at good quality, which is something that I can imagine some people are finding it uncomfortable. And to your point about the group that you're working with, lower mid-market, first-time CEOs, founder-led companies, they've not always had that surrounding stakeholder base that's supportive, or they can bounce ideas off. So it's the one person making the call. And I think depending on where they're coming from in terms of their background, analysis paralysis might take hold, and all sorts of things probably happen.
My encouragement is to self-diagnose, right? So wherever you are on the spectrum, right, of decisiveness, recognize where you are, and ideally have someone on your board or personal board of advisors or on your senior team that is counter, right, your natural tendencies, and explicitly position them to be that counter in critical decisions. So you've got somebody, if you're not decisive, who is and is pushing you to move. And if you are decisive, they're like, wait a minute, we've got 100 people that need to follow, or 1,000 people, or 100,000 people. We actually need to think this through a little bit more. You want that counter foil to whatever your natural tendency is. So I encourage people to think about that, and then just ask 2 questions. The first is what will the cost be if you get the decision wrong? And secondly, how much will you slow down your organization by not making a decision today, this week, this month? And weigh those 2.
No, I think that's really good. I think a lot of people listening will probably have to reflect hard on the decision-making capabilities. But the other thing, one question that pops up is, how much of this, Kim, is intrinsic, these behaviors? And as you especially work with the folks you're working with, our lower market founders, you're finding it's there, it's in abundance, or it's there but needs to be cultivated, versus it's just not there. And do you find that if you had 2 or 3 of the 4 things, that's still pretty awesome? Or do you have to have the 4 with equal amounts on a pie chart to give that success potential?
Yeah. So we did look at this, and it is rare to be top quartile across all 4.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Okay, so that's number 1. They're all important behaviors, but most individuals are not going to be exceptional at all 4. Yeah. I would say if we looked at the high performers, I want to say it was 98% were top quartile in 1. It was roughly, I think half were top quartile in 2. So the way to think about this is most leaders are going to be strong in probably 2 of these behaviors. And it's back to my comment earlier around being self-aware, so that you're kind of complementing yourself with people around you. That if you're, let's say you're an incredible kind of visionary and idea guy, but you're not the individual to really kind of drive reliable delivery into the organization and clarify expectations and hold people accountable, hold yourself radically personally accountable. Okay, well, you might want to think about having that operator style, leader on your team, or someone around you giving you counsel on how to do that, because it is something that is important to embody for the organization to deliver and be successful. But maybe it's not you who is the individual leading the way, if you will. So I think it comes down to awareness, kind of self-diagnostic. And honestly, yeah, all of these are behaviors I have seen leaders grow. Like, for example, working with a CEO founder right now, not the most decisive. So I'm going to give you the counter example to the other one I'm working with. So not the most decisive, but he's very self-aware. And so it is an active focus of our conversations around how do we support him in pulling the trigger faster on certain key priority decisions. They're framed this way. We discuss it in terms of decisiveness, and it's an open conversation. We also, he specifically hired someone, as I mentioned earlier, who had very strong decisiveness gene. And this individual moves incredibly quickly. And it's uncomfortable, but it is necessary to kind of balance out the pace of the organization. And so, yeah, I would say for that particular CEO, you're not going to have someone who is I'm just going to make this up, like a 2 on the scale of 10, right? They're not going to get to 9 out of 10.
Yeah.
But if you can push them to get to 5 out of 10 and hire individuals that balance them out, the organization can move at pace.
I really, as you're saying, I'm seeing 2 things. One is that the takeaway for me is that, first of all, being a leader doesn't come with the title. And I've always said that just because you've got a title doesn't make you a leader. And that's a fallacy a lot of people think of, like, oh, I get the title, I'm now a leader. The fact is that people all throughout your organizational stack can be in leadership roles and can exhibit leadership qualities. And I think your counsel is, it's okay if you don't have these behaviors, be self-aware, but then build a team. So a high performing team should have the dare quality, if anything, at that, whether it's your exec team or your entire organization. But think of dare as the group of people or group of leaders making those choices, going back to your point about prioritization and execution. That's one takeaway. So how the lesson for me and those listening is be aware, see what you don't have, build on it, but also recognize that you can fast track that by getting the right people around you. And maybe they're already in your organization. You don't have to go hire them. Just identify who they are so they can complement. So the overall organizational dare goes up. That's the one thing. And then the other thing that sort of comes to mind as you're describing it is, perhaps the word awareness sits really well with me, because that is one thing that I found, that lack of awareness doesn't allow somebody to get into the dare model, because it almost doesn't exist. And so question for you is that why wasn't awareness like a behavior that was trumped all these 4? Say, without awareness, you can't even play. I'm being sort of dramatic, but I thought I'd sort of ask the question because I agree with you that it is such a unique thing, because with that awareness comes humility and empathy. And then, so it can, not always, but can come, usually does. And then allows you to do exactly what you are counseling, which is, hey, once you're aware, then you kind of know what you want to work on and what you need to complement. But just a question on awareness, like how come?
Yeah, so I've got one very simple answer, which is it did not come back as an identifiable behavior or trait in the research, right? It was very much kind of science driven, if you will.
Yeah.
The one place where I would say was maybe a little more explicitly underpinning a behavior, which would be adapting proactively. Mm-hmm. So one of the things we had to go do was, when the research came back, we had to go kind of tease out, well, what does it mean, right, to adapt proactively? Like, what does that look like? What are these leaders doing? And one of the elements we saw expressed by leaders who adapted proactively were they were willing to let go of what had worked in the past. That's part and parcel, right, of adapting, is stopping what you were doing and doing something new. Very simple, right? But those that did that were quite, like, there was an underpinning of humility and self-awareness, that just because something had driven success in it, this is really easy to say and very hard to do. You have to be very self-aware and humble to say, whatever has made me successful to this moment, I'm going to stop doing, because I don't believe it will drive success in the future. That is an extremely hard thing to do. And the leaders who were able to do that had a very high degree of humility. And were willing to listen to signals and data that would lead them to say, whether if it was personal, it was 360 data, or if it was, business that was market data or competitor data. Anyway, whatever it was, they were humble enough and self-aware enough to accept that feedback and to make adjustments. So that was the one place where it was maybe a little more explicit, but it's a fair push. You could argue it'd be difficult to progress on these dimensions without self-awareness.
Yeah, you remind me, I sort of go to the athletes, right? The high-performing athletes. And I always use athletes, and people who listen to my podcast know that because I'm in awe of athletes. I'm a wannabe athlete. I'll always be one. Probably won't get there professionally, right? And so they're very self-aware of their bodies. And as they progress in their career and they get older, they recognize what's happening. And then they have to let go of the behaviors and the training and the methods and the programming they had in the past because it's just not working, right? And if you look at some of the top performing athletes in the NBA or tennis or any sport, gymnastics, they really are adapting. And so I wonder, like, now that I'm going back to that model and saying, okay, where else does the leadership model manifest itself? Of course, you and I are talking through the lens of business, private equity, low mid-market, but it sort of manifests in day-to-day life, right? And so when I think of those athletes who do really well in the outer years of their career, are adapting, are self-aware, first of all, they're both bio-aware as well as aware of their surroundings and how the game is changing and the competition is changing to the things you're mentioning, but then how they can adapt and change and rewire, which is going to be incredibly difficult because if you've been successful doing what you've been doing and winning, now you're like, well, hang on, I want to keep playing and keep winning. I have to be different. But I love that challenge, that especially as you're talking about CEOs and leaders who've been doing things for a long time and have gotten to a point, they're like, well, okay, that worked for me. Like, well, it's no longer going to work. And again, it comes back to what are you solving for? If you're solving for that you don't care, then maybe none of this applies. But if you do, then it does help. Kim, one thing that you obviously are spending a lot of time in the space of private equity and helping portfolio companies do all of this work. As an investor or the investor group, when they're looking to bring on new leadership, how much of, and private equity is a different animal in that as we know, there's a different set of dynamics at play given the timelines and the expected returns on capital. Does that change how you bring on a leader or how you cultivate and groom an existing founder to be a better leader through the lens of PE?
So, I would first say to do a great job in selecting a leader of any PE-backed business, it starts with what success is defined as, right? There's a whole set of skills and outcomes, frankly, that you want for this business that DARE does not touch. These are underpinning behaviors, right, for leadership. And so to get that hire right, number one is getting really crisp on the scorecard and not making that definition of success so much of a pink unicorn that it's impossible. I mean, you know this too, like working, you want it all and you want it all yesterday and it's impossible. And so really forcing the prioritization of the value creation lever experience or however you're going to drive value in this business, making sure you're very crisp on what matters most. Because there's no all-weather CEO, in my opinion. I'm, always open to be convinced with data, but I personally think that you really need to understand the situation, context in which you're placing a leader first. And does that align with, can you amplify those strengths? And I think the DARE behaviors are a lot about how they go about creating value in a business. I could argue the weighting of the behaviors might vary depending on the context, right? PE being one context. But I think they are all still relevant, right? Reliable delivery, proactively setting expectations with your investors when the market is changing, making the implicit explicit is absolutely the best. PE-backed CEOs are in their investors' faces, getting very, very clear around, if I achieve this budget, it is successful, right? Or do you want me to rebudget? No, I mean, I think you could pick off any of these behaviors and they are still relevant. I would certainly say for some markets at some points in time, like when you look at some of the SaaS, the SaaS growth and like 2021, 2021, the ability to proactively adapt, I think you would not be successful without that. Those CEOs really, you'd weight that heavier, right, than some of the other behaviors, but I still believe they are all relevant.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, because I think of it two pieces as I reflect on what you said. Number one is that, the context in which the person is being brought in. And so before that, I often used to go through this calculus, which is we're buying a company, the management's coming in, founder-led. I always start with, I want to be able to work with whoever it is on the other side of the table and help them be successful. Of course, you start there, unless there's always an explicit conversation that, they're moving on, in which case you bring on somebody from the external or promote internally. But the idea is that the bigger point that you're making is that be clear on what you're solving for when you're making a change, which applies. It's a broad statement, but specifically here. And I think from a context perspective, you maybe, when the private equity fund's hiring somebody, you've got to realize what change are you trying to affect, right? Is it, cultural change? So there needs to be a lot of flexibility. Is it market dynamics? And again, to a wise counsel, I don't think you can hear enough of it, which is you can't have it all. So prioritize. We've had lots of internal conversations in my private equity days where we're like, well, what about this and that? And so I think hyper prioritization on what is it that you need to bring in or have somebody develop into to be able to achieve the goals. I think that's really important. As we're getting closer to the end of our conversation, I've got two specific questions. One is that as you think about the leaders who are listening to this conversation, people who are wanting to get into leadership roles, what are things that you say, hey, look, we've got 4 traits. You said not all 4 of them are going to be equal for the most part, and not everyone's going to have a spike on all 4 of them. And so which of these 4 traits do you think is something that people can work on themselves, right? Mm-hmm. Versus they need to potentially partner up with somebody to be able to help them deliver, which is sort of self-development versus a coachable trait that you need a coach on.
Yeah.
That's part one.
I mean, I might sidestep this one, Rohit, and say, we didn't get a chance really to get into all of the 4 in depth around what would it take to strengthen this muscle. We definitely do that in the book. There's a lot more context there and a lot more stories around what this looks like. Because I would actually argue it is difficult to improve without feedback, right? So if you have no ability to self-diagnose where you are on these behaviors, it's hard. So step 1 is making sure you've got someone to reflect to you if you don't have a perspective on where you stand. But I personally believe you can get better if you have feedback and a roadmap on any of the 4. Again, I don't think you're going to move from a 1 to a 10 or a 2 to a 10, but you can certainly affect enough change, especially early in your career, to consider yourself adequate to strong on any of these 4 behaviors. And, I think it kind of comes back to your earlier comment, as long as you have the self-awareness and humility to open yourself up to feedback on whether you're progressing or not.
Yeah, maybe that's the place to start. That's the counsel, which is, let's reflect on self-awareness. And then I think then you give yourself the best shot to get into it. Last question, Kim. Any as you leave our audience, what is the one do and one don't when you think about what leaders should do and should not do, or investors should do or should not do as they reflect on leadership and people skills specifically? What will be your counsel?
I mean, I would start with be able to articulate where you're naturally strong. So are you decisive? Can you motivate people? Or and equally be able to articulate what you're not good at. Do you struggle with conflict? Do you move slowly on decisions, regarding spend, whatever it might be? I think that is my number 1 for everyone, is what you're good at and what you're not good at, and be willing to state that openly and embrace kind of support and complementary leaders.
Love it. Kim, thank you so much. This has been super insightful. I'm going to go away and start looking at my own profile, but thank you for coming on. Thank you for sharing all the insights, both from your research and work you've done, but also what you do now. So thank you again for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure. Thanks, Rohit.
Looking for more ideas on how to accelerate your business growth, hire amazing people, and improve your leadership potential? Check out our full-length episodes on the People Quotient podcast. Subscribe now.